On the way out of El Paso, a man who looked like a bloated dead spider in a beige-collared shirt walked up to my cart and said, "I'm going to steal that thing from you." I'm on the side of a side road just off Highway 54. I didn't make it very far today, but I actually made it about as far as I could go because just a few miles further north along the highway is the southern border of the White Sands Missile Range. I lay there getting lit up by the passing vehicles, squaring myself up each time to the idea of getting hit. Then the police showed up. They told me I was camped at a semi-pullout where the morning traffic started at 3 a.m., but that I wasn't doing anything illegal. They actually advised me to trespass to the other side of the fence and sleep there, though they said they couldn't really make me do it. The next day I walked more than 35 miles in a straight line. I turned north from El Paso in order to avoid hundreds of miles of waterless desert near the border. The alternative was to detour through the Tularosa Basin to the Air Force town of Alamogordo, and then cross the Sacramento Mountains onto the Llano Estacado, an enormous plateau the U.S. Army once described as a desolate waste of uninhabitable solitude. I could see from pictures that the roads across the plateau were all lined with barbed wire, so I didn't have a clue where I'd be able to sleep once I got there, but it seemed like the best of several bad options. Alamogordo felt like the western town taken to its logical extreme. It started off with a railroad and resource extraction. Now the main drag is dominated by chain businesses, and the inevitable nearby military base is the biggest in the United States. The outskirts dwindle into miles of trailer homes. I stayed with a local Air Force engineer, and his bookcase was almost my undoing. I started reading Sebastian Junger's War in the middle of packing to leave. By 10 a.m., my host said I could take the book with me. At the foot of the Sacramento Mountains, I passed a military surplus store called Moore's Trading Post. It was advertising live rattlesnakes and flying the Confederate rebel battle flag just across the street from the biggest military base in the United States.
This is the most dangerous road I've been on this entire trip. The reason I'm out of breath right now is because I just came uncomfortably close to getting hit. I guess it's only appropriate, having come into the Intermountain West through Snoqualmie Tunnel. Now I'll be leaving the Intermountain West through another tunnel. This is really gonna suck.
I'd spent most of the day in a series of uphill sprints, pushing about 100 pounds of gear, my knee considerably worse after dashing around El Paso. My host in Alamogordo had said the Sacramento Mountains were about 2,500 feet tall, but I was starting to wonder.
Cloudcroft Village limit, elevation 8,650.
A passing driver invited me to stay at his house that night. He lived another 7 or 8 miles away, but I said I'd do my best, and he drove off. Then he came back and gave me a piece of pie. More people stopped to see if I needed help. Finally, 3 vehicles from the Otero Sheriff's Office converged on me, saying they'd gotten calls about a female pushing a baby stroller. Then my host's son drove by to ask if I wanted a lift to the house, which was up a dirt road partially covered in snow and ice. I said I'd keep walking, but his dad turned up again a few minutes later to make sure I didn't get lost. I walked the last 2 miles of the day behind his exhaust pipe as he shouted questions at me over the growl of the engine. By the time we reached the house, I was ravenous, but couldn't eat. I was exhausted, but couldn't sleep. In the morning, the family dogs followed me all the way back down to the highway, and I had to borrow a passing driver's cell phone to get them rescued.
Somewhere on the way up here in the dark last night, I took off my hat and forgot that my headlamp was still around my forehead, and that just went ping off in the darkness without me realizing it. Somewhere along this stretch of road, and I'm hoping that I might just happen to see it, but chances of that are pretty low. And I just wiped out on the ice, coming down the hill, lost control of the cart, skidded down the road for a bit behind it with it dragging me, and chewed up my hip a little bit. And yesterday took enough out of me that my left leg actually it's got a little sewing machine action going first thing in the morning.
I'd also strained my left hamstring, because it's important to be thorough.
Trying to enjoy the forest here, because this is probably the last forest I'm going to see in a long time. I think what I like most is the smell. Desert so seldom it smells like anything.
One passing driver asked if I walked this stretch of road often, and told me that if I saw her dog, I should throw rocks at it.
A car just pulled up behind me, and the man leaned out of the window and said, "You doing all right? Where are you going?" When I told him I was walking across the country, he said, "Don't take no wooden nickels."
When I reached the hamlet of Mayhill, the postmaster came up to me and asked if I had a moment. She said a neighbor had driven past me earlier and given her a $20 bill to give me when I arrived. I thought I might look for a new flashlight at the convenience store and see about the apple cider they were advertising, but it turned out the windows were dim. I'd left Alamogordo with a big jar of applesauce, and as my diet went completely haywire, apples in general got to be a compelling idea. I hadn't known eastern New Mexico was an apple-growing region. Part of my frustration with Bill Crouch's racist right-wing convenience store came from turning my back on his racist right-wing apple cider. When I saw another apple stand coming up on the side of the highway, covered in crosses but slogan-free, I decided to give it a try. I got to talking with the owner, Tom Runyon, and he told me that NAFTA had ruined his grazing operation with shutting down his orchard, that the Sierra Club and the Democrats had destroyed him by reintroducing wild cats to the mountains, that his neighbors were drug addicts on welfare, that Obama's plot against Israel was prophesied to bring about the centering of the United States along the New Madrid fault line and the flooding of the Mississippi River leading to a mass nuclear catastrophe, and that he was stockpiling guns and ammunition so that when the fighting started he'd be ready. He got so mad about the president being black he went red in the face. Then he went to show a couple of other customers the llamas in his petting zoo.
Sometimes people will ask me what I'm learning through traveling like this. And if I had to say what things seem to be building up to right now as a lesson, I would say that in the United States there will be a civil war soon.
Around midday, I passed the first other cross-country walker I'd met, a lone man maybe 50 years old who'd done the Appalachian Trail and then decided to carry on west across the southern states. He only carried 2 liters of water at a time, and said he spent most of the previous nights next to oil wells.
Welcome to the Great Plains.
On the way into Artesia, I could see 20 miles straight ahead down the road. I could see each pair of headlights coming straight at me for 20 minutes at a time. I could see everything clear till noon tomorrow. By the time I reached town and found a motel, I'd walked more than 39 miles that day. I got 2 hours of sleep and kept moving.
I feel surprisingly normal. It's almost like I've forgotten how to fall asleep. Coming to Artesia in the dark last night, the lights on the refinery made it look like some sort of fairy tale kingdom. Not quite the same in daylight. It was surprisingly pretty when it was far away and you couldn't smell what it was spitting out.
The long grade out of town was the climb onto the Llanos de Caro. But the farther I went, the more I realized my expectations about the place had been completely wrong. I expected an endless nothingness strung with barbed wire. Instead, I found myself in the middle of the Permian Basin oil and gas boom. The baseline here is desolation. In this part of the high plains, there's hardly any water, hardly anything can grow, and the temperature fluctuations are extreme. It's a brutally hard country. Hundreds of years ago, the Comanches used it as a staging ground for slave raids, striking on horseback and retreating into wastes where no one could follow. Then it turned into cattle drive country for a decade or so, until conditions on the plains killed so many cattle that the industry collapsed. The discovery of oil and gas under the plains was like a firework going off in an empty sky. Landowners could suddenly make a fortune leasing otherwise worthless property to oil and gas companies, and people poured into the area from all over the country to work in the fields, drilling, pumping, piping, and trucking. Never mind that burning fossil fuels drives global warming. Never mind that groundwater has grown too poisonous to drink. Never mind the spills, the leaks, the deliberate injections of immense quantities of proprietary fracking slurries, the noxious evaporation ponds, and the constant threat of hydrogen sulfide gas. This was a wasteland to start with, so nobody cares what becomes of it. You could not do this to a place you cared about. After walking 18 or 19 miles through the field, second thoughts got the better of me. It wasn't just the explosion of warning signs, it was the obvious and powerful stench blanketing the entire landscape. Virtually every tank, pump, and passing truck was leaking hydrogen sulfide. I hadn't known a thing about this in advance. The other walker from the day before hadn't mentioned it. Hydrogen sulfide is a weapons-grade nerve gas. It's invisible and heavier than air, so it collects and concentrates in low-lying areas. One of the first things it does to you is destroy your ability to smell it. Every tank cluster in the fields includes a windsock to indicate which way the gas is blowing, and people who work in the fields carry detectors to warn them if the concentration spikes. A single bad breath can cause knockdown, instantaneous loss of consciousness, or death. Just about the most dangerous thing you could do would be to sleep night after night on the ground behind tanks, which is exactly what the other walker had done. After learning all this by phone on the side of the road, I came to the conclusion that a week-long camping trip across the Permian Basin wasn't a good idea. So I walked back to Artesia. I kept falling asleep, trying to keep my eyes on the lights of the refinery and waking up in the ditch.
Yeah, H2S, it's very dangerous in that area, so if you get into a strong enough area of H2S there, you wouldn't even know it, you'd just be out. Walking through that area without a detector, that's probably not the best of ideas. I mean, I've actually had deputies go down on me before just because they were in that area. It's some dangerous stuff.
I got back to the motel at about 1 a.m. and booked another 2 nights. The rates were 2 or 3 times higher in Artesia than they were in other parts of New Mexico because the boom meant paychecks, but I needed to figure out what I was going to do. By this point, 8 days out of El Paso, I'd lost so much ground and so much time that it was extremely unlikely I'd make it to New Orleans for Mardi Gras. Getting there had been a fairly arbitrary goal, but I was tired of disappointment. I wanted to finish this thing right. For what felt like the 100th time, I set about trying to work out a feasible alternate route, and in between sessions with maps, I stumbled on the Buds Class 234 documentary on YouTube. It's 6 hours long, and I watched it maybe 3 times in a row. Then I packed up and headed south.
Well, whereas east of Artesia, the very air you breathe is a poisonous fume. The air doesn't smell quite so foul down here. So far, I'm thinking that this detour back south again, through Carlsbad and then Pecos and then Fort Stockton, might just turn out to be a good decision after all. Fingers crossed. This store sells adult novelties, smoking accessories, and knives. For lunch I had a tub of rice pudding and a carton of chocolate milk. And that was about 2.5 hours ago. And now I'm kind of suddenly gone into some kind of physical shock. I can only assume as a result of what I had for lunch. And normally I would address a problem like this by eating some cheese, but lately I've been having trouble digesting cheese for some reason, so no cheese in a larder. And I'm trying what I've got as an alternative. One of the things that's interesting in a case like this is you definitely are reminded of how when you stress the body, you stress the mind, as the mind is just one part of the system. So it's not just that I feel kind of weird throughout, but my thinking's not quite right either. Goodnight Loving Trail. After leaving Fort Sumner, the Goodnight Loving Trail forked in two directions. This branch, developed by Oliver Loving in 1866, followed the Pecos River to Las Vegas and the Santa Fe Trail to Raton Pass. The Great Texas Cattle Drives followed this and other routes to Colorado and Wyoming until 1880. It's always a magical feeling on a partially cloudy day when a ray of sunlight suddenly sweeps over. Sometimes it really is just the simple things. Wes English handed me $20 in case I needed a hot meal at some point. He pointed out that the temperatures tonight are supposed to drop pretty low, and that if I were trying to get out of it, the only place this side of Pecos is, here pointed to the map, a little place called Mentone, which is off the road eastward. And I thought, Mentone, aha, I remember that name. If memory serves, that is the only settlement in the least densely populated county in the United States outside of Alaska.
There's a moment just as something goes wrong when you don't have time to react, but you're intensely aware of the bad thing happening.
Ow!
The thorn had punched most of the way through the ball joint of my left big toe. Two guys in a passing pickup offered me a ride to Pecos, but I figured so long as I could still walk, I should just get there myself.
The big excitement will be if the thing doesn't get infected. And I am glad that I got that tetanus shot back in Seattle when I cracked my head on that wall. Cheers.
I fell asleep and then woke an hour later to find my foot was swelling badly. Walking to Pecos the next day no longer seemed remotely like a good idea, more like a prelude to a horrible infection. But my chances of catching a ride were a lot bleaker than they'd been a couple of hours earlier. Now it was dark and well below freezing, and I could barely get my shoe back on to keep moving. My flashlight was somewhere on a mountainside in New Mexico, and no one was stopping for a homeless guy with a bike trailer half glimpsed in the headlights at 60 miles an hour. Almost all the passing vehicles were tank trucks, so if I caught a ride with one of them, I'd have to leave the cart behind. None of them did stop, though, so I kept walking. Shortly after midnight, a drilling consultant stopped for me on his way to the job site. He drove me all the way to Pecos, dropped me at the ER, and gave me $60.